Good afternoon. If you could have your seat, welcome. So I would like to extend a warm welcome to the audience in the room and online. As you know, as usual with these EPRS events, we are web streaming live on WebEx platform. And it's also the first event of the season, the first event after the election in June and the new term. And a special welcome to Mrs. Laluc, the chair of the Economic Committee, and Mr. Murejan. Thank you for doing us the honor to be with us today. Thank you also, of course, to the panelists. Our event today is about a simple question. Is Next Generation EU delivering? The answer, however, is less easy. A few weeks ago, the Draghi report spoke of an existential challenge for the European Union. To become more productive and competitive, the Union will require courageous reform and also massive amounts of investment. In fact, the EU is already carrying out what could be seen as a major experiment with Next Generation EU or NGEU, the recovery instrument. For these reasons, we have decided to hold a roundtable on how Next Generation EU is progressing. We have just published a latest edition of our EPRS Economic Outlook Quarterly. It provides a very useful snapshot of the state of play of Next Generation EU and its recovery plans. The recovery plans are at the intersection of economic and budgetary policies. And we are delighted that Madame Laluc and Mr. Murejan are speaking at this event today and to give their view and perspective to frame the debate. First, I turn to Mrs. Laluc. You have been a member of the Parliament since 2019. You are from the Socialists and Democrats. Since July, you are chair of the Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs. You trained as an economist and founded the Webben Institute. You were rapporteur on various texts, notably the directive establishing the minimum taxation of multinationals and for the regulation on the transparency and integrity of the environmental, social, and governance, ESG rating activities. Thank you for being with us, and you have the
floor. Morning. I don't know what time it is now. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for this invitation, and I just want to stress the fact that EPRS is very useful to us, and that we are very honored to be here today, and that we can always count on your support and your input. Regarding the subject we are for what I'm talking about today, I had long been campaigning to equip the Union with instruments to jointly finance reforms and investments. And when I joined the European Parliament in 2019, as you said, no one could have imagined that a recovery and resilience facility would emerge barely a year after that. And it is often said that European achievements are built and leap forward during crisis. Certainly, the RRF is a huge step forward that came to life due to the COVID pandemic. But what about today? Is this tool living up to its promises? And what is the future of Next Generation EU? The question we are facing today can be answered simply. Is Next Generation EU delivering? I think it has, actually. If we now look in detail regarding the implementation and the challenges. A recent midterm evaluation has highlighted the key role of the RRF in supporting recovery across Europe and boosting social reforms and investment. While many public authorities are the final recipients, approximately 2.8 million companies have benefited from RRF funding so far. However, the review also points out the need for more flexibility in the design and implementation of national plans. It concludes that it is too early to measure the full effect of the RRF. Additionally, The RRF has faced frequent delays, both on the Commission side and in their assessment of payment requests, and by member states also in completing milestones and targets, thus delaying their requests for payment. Beyond the issues linked to the implementation of investment and reform, another challenge lies ahead of us, and it's a huge one, the repayment of the RRF. It has always struck me that during the urgent situation we faced in 2020, we were able to reach an agreement on issuing common debt, a red line for so many countries at the time, but not one on resources to repay it. Sure, there was a deal on proposed own resources, but most were either too small to be credible or far from being achievable. The resource expected to bring the most income depends on an international tax reform that is far from a global deal, especially considering that the US opposes it, and I refer here to Pillar 1. A new proposal from the Commission was issued last summer and would request member states to give a share of the profit income tax to the EU budget, and it would need to be adopted by unanimity. So this term, we, Econ members, together with our colleagues from the Budget Committee, should join forces to finally make meaningful progress on new own resources or taxes that work for real. Regarding the establishment of a future performance-based instrument in the next MFF, the political discussion might arise earlier than expected. There is a timing mismatch between our MFF negotiation and the formal end of the RRF. One key factor to help deliver on RRF-funded projects and have a real debate on the future of public investment financing will be to align the end of RRF with MFF. It will give countries more time and strengthen the balance of power between all decision makers, including the Parliament, for future negotiation. Now, let me turn to the lesson learned from our current experience. Indeed, the Parliament remained committed to closely monitoring the implementation of the RRF. We regularly hold dialogues with the commissioners in charge and have dedicated working group together with Budge. We also released an implementation report in 2022, and we will continue to do so. The first conclusion we can draw is that implementation of the plan might not be fully delivering on its goals, particularly regarding the green transition and the delivery of cross-border projects. We were witnessing similar shortcomings with EU. Some member states are merely recycling old plans that had been shelved. The European Court of Auditors recently published 2 insightful reports that will guide our future work. Like us, they identified risk to the timely absorption and completion of measures in the second half of the RF implementation. They also pointed out weaknesses in the design and implementation of the facility, raising doubts about whether it will achieve its climate and environmental objectives. The Court of Auditors concluded that the RRF contribution to the green transition is not clear yet. What can we do to improve the delivery of the future RRF-inspired instruments? I think we should ensure greater synergies with other funds first. Second, we should improve follow-up mechanism and better define who the final beneficiaries of the funds are, even so 25 member states have already provided the mandatory list of the 100 largest recipients of funding. We need to focus more also on the design of cross-border projects. Like many of you in this room, I suppose, I've paid careful attention to the Draghi report. I agree with Mr. Draghi that the funding of Next Generation EU has set a well-established precedent for the use of the common safe asset. The Draghi report also emphasizes the role of private finance. But as I have said before, and I will continue to assert, private finance alone will not allow us to build the sustainable industrial strategy that the EU deserves. Far from it, by the way. Draghi mentioned the need for additional investment equivalent to nearly 5% of GDP. He also rightly reminded us that the Marshall Plan amounted to only 1–2% of GDP. While we are discussing 5% of GDP, while the EU had just adopted new economic government rules that prevent a deficit above 3% of GDP, which might look a little bit contradictory. We are already behind in our political and economic response to the Inflation Reduction Act. We must put our industry and public investment to support the Green Deal objective and rather soon. Other regions of the world understand that boosting competitiveness requires both private and public investment, and the climate is not waiting for EU leaders to finally come to an agreement to warm up. There is an urgency to act, but the good news is that we already made significant progress in building the first instrument. This new term is about finishing, I hope, what we started and making it last. This is our responsibility. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Laluc, for this most stimulating contribution. I now turn to Mr. Mourchan for the budgetary point of view. You have been member of the Parliament since 2014. You are from the EPP. You are the European Parliament co-rapporteur for the upcoming MFF, Multi-Annual Financial Framework, 2028-2034. And you were twice the European Parliament rapporteur for the annual budget. You were also co-rapporteur for key EU legislation files, like the establishment of the Recovery and Resilience Facility. So over to you. Go to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Good afternoon, dear colleagues, dear friends. It's good to see you all here. Many of you having worked on the RRF, having facilitated its creation, its implementation. Thank you very much to the EPRS for the work, for the studies, for the support, and also for the debate today. And Aurore, thank you very much to you also for joining and for making sure that the topic stays high on the agenda of the Econ Committee. It continues to remain important. Look, at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, first wave hit some member states disproportionately high. And we saw particularly the medical systems in some member states, but also other parts of the social security systems of the economy being overwhelmed. The European Union didn't stay still, and the European Commission proposed at the end of May, less than 2–3 months after the beginning of the pandemic, an instrument without precedent. It was the largest package of economic support ever put forward at the level of the European Union, saying, we're ready for the first time to issue bonds in this magnitude to support member states affected by the pandemic, people, enterprises, regions, but also to make sure that never again in the future they are affected in such a way by a pandemic, to increase their resilience. And the common denominator was the following. We said we're ready to do this exercise without precedent in terms of magnitude, in terms of philosophy, but under very precise circumstances. It should be a unique instrument for a unique crisis. It should be limited in time, it should be very precise in scope, and based on a clear principle of conditionality. We're funding investments, while in parallel we are expecting reforms to be done, reforms which are good for member states. They improve their competitiveness and they increase the resilience of their economy, but also of their public systems, and make sure that never again in the future we are being caught unprepared by a similar crisis, neither the healthcare, nor the public administration, nor the education systems. So an unprecedented instrument to an unprecedented crisis, but under very clear rules, very clear conditions, and this was the only way to find a common denominator between countries and political forces, which in the past some said, you know, the European Union should issue common bonds forever and for whatever, and some saying, no, keeping our public finances in order, servicing our debt is an issue of national responsibility. We managed to reach this common denominator by the end of 2020, the Parliament and the Council have agreed with the support of the European Commission on the legislative files to create the Recovery and Resilience Facility. From the very beginning, it was a project, a program for investments and reforms. Whenever money is involved, people tend to talk primarily about money, but the Recovery and Resilience Facility is a project where investments and reforms are equally important. And this is why we said member states should receive disbursements from their RRF envelopes in exchange for the implementation of milestones and targets linked to reforms. And as I said, this is a new instrument. We had to create new structures, primarily in the European Commission, and I would like to thank colleagues in the European Commission, primarily the Director General, Celine Gauer, who is here with us, for all the efforts that they made in creating the structures, in making sure that the plans put forward by the member states were adopted fast and the implementation could start fast. Now, where are we? What are some of the findings? Firstly, obviously, it had a very significant. The very idea of the creation of Next Generation EU, of the Recovery and Resilience Facility, had a very significant positive impact upon investors in Europe during very difficult times during the pandemic. So it kept many enterprises going, it kept public authorities funding their expenditures, their investments, knowing that European support would come. It had a very important, including psychological effect for the markets, for the private sector since day one. Secondly, it incentivized reforms which otherwise would not have been done at the level of member states, and this clearly is a very positive conclusion as well. Likewise, it finances investments which otherwise might have had significant difficulties in being funded. And on the types of investments which we're funding, let me say a few words. We have the budget of the European Union. The money from the 2014-2020 budget was still available to member states up to the end of 2023. The RRF is in place until 2026. So what we saw was governments investing significant political attention, political capital into drafting their RRF plans. We saw governments being interested in not losing the money from the 2014-2020 budget, which expired at the end of 2023, but we saw delays, significant delays in the startup of the 2021-2027 multi-annual financial framework, simply because now member states say the RRF is available up to 2026, time pressure is big, we shouldn't lose the money, we should focus on this, there is more time for the MFF. So what I want to say is we should make sure that there is no cannibalization between the traditional budget of the European Union and the RRF. The additionality of the RRF is important in the sense that it should primarily fund investments which otherwise can't be funded. What we need to make sure is that there is complementarity between the traditional budget of the European Union and this new unique instrument. We did not create this instrument to fund investments which we could have funded otherwise as well. From cohesion policy, for example, we created this instrument to fund investments which otherwise would not have found funding. Time pressure wasn't helpful in that sense, in the sense that when this was created, we said it's a fund to react to a crisis without precedent. The Council proposed the Recovery and Resilience Facility to basically end by 2026, so a 3+3 years approach. We on the Parliament side, look, we would propose a 4+3 years. This should go up to 2027. But given particularly the pressure of net contributing countries from the Council, which said 7 years after the start of the pandemic, you cannot advocate that an investment made is still linked to the pandemic. Then, of course, in 2020, the second, third, fourth wave of COVID were not foreseen, and the longer-term impacts, social and economic impacts, were maybe not foreseen, and it was also thought to be an instrument of an immediate reaction. What I'm trying to say is the following. The result was that everything has to finish by 2026. There is a certain time pressure, and what we are seeing is projects put forward that are mature, that beneficiaries have a high degree of confidence, belief that they can finish them by 2026. This is the right thing to do from the perspective of beneficiaries, given the time pressure, but what we would want to see is more innovative, more disruptive projects, more risk-taking projects, which would really bring our economy forward, being funded, being financed. There are some good examples in some of the plans of the countries. We, of course, also wanted this to support member states, but to have a clear European added value. And the way in which the instrument works is that each member state puts forward their plan, their national recovery plan. The Commission adopts it, then it's being implemented. And what we would have wished for as a Parliament was more cross-border projects, supporting more projects which go beyond the interest of one single member state. And we believe this hasn't happened to a significant degree, and this conclusion we have to insert also into our future work to make sure that we use the European financial tools that we have to fund projects that have European added value. Then, of course, now the national recovery plans are pretty much a contract between the European Commission and the national governments. This is good. But we believe that very often, and we saw it, for example, including now with the floods, some of the very specific needs on the ground are best known by local regional authorities. We, as the European Parliament, have wanted from the beginning for the local and regional level to be involved as much as possible in the elaboration, but also in the implementation of the recovery resilience plans. Tell this to the Council, tell this to the governments. Obviously, there would be resistance. The reality is that the governments had to consult the local and regional authorities, and then in the end it was pretty much at their discretion to what degree they took into account the demands of the local and regional authorities. And the European Commission has, of course, been trying to be very helpful in there, but we do not feel that we have the legal instruments due to the opposition of the Council in the legislative process to really make sure that the demands, the proposals, the idea, the projects that are being brought forward by the local and regional level are included in the plans. And I think this is a reflection that we need to keep in mind for our future decisions, design, budgets, making sure that the local and regional level is properly involved. Transparency. We're now spending from the Recovery Resilience Facility, plus the budget of the Union, more money than ever. People have a right to know how the money is being spent and that money is being well spent. Of course, with the European Public Prosecutor's creation, with the existence of OLAF, with the role of the European Court of Auditors, we have now more tools than ever, particularly since the creation of the European Public Prosecutor, to make sure that irregularities and fraud are being tackled. But transparency is important, and what I want to say is we need to make sure that money is well spent. We need to know how it is being spent. We need to know which are the final beneficiaries. My sense is that the public opinion expects this. Citizens, not only in net contributing countries, but everywhere within Europe, want to know that the budget is well spent and how it is spent. Of course, we have the rule of law conditionality that is applying since the creation of the new MFF 2027, which says if you want European funds, you should respect European values, and there are certain pieces of legislation which apply in different manners to different types of funds. I won't enter into details, but what I want to say is with the budget of the European Union, with the Recovery Resilience Facility, we saw two member states, Hungary and Poland, not respecting European values and having some of their EU funds being frozen. In the case of Hungary, still now about 20 billion euros. So the creation of the rule of law conditionality in the context of the adoption of the MFF and then also in the context of the creation of the RRF is also an additional tool to make sure that we link European funds with European values, and this obviously should continue in the future. Now, to conclude, as I said, initially this was created as an instrument during a deep crisis to try to help, to provide immediate support. Now it has emerged more and more into an instrument helping us to make sure that we improve the resilience of the economies of member states, of their public sectors. Aurora is totally right when in all of what she says with regards to the Draghi report. What I want to say is that if member states implement the reforms that they are foreseen to implement as part of their national recovery plans, that will make our economy more competitive, and partly it is also linked to steps which the Draghi report demands. So now I would advise us to focus on the implementation to make sure that the delays are as little as possible. Do we have some delays? Yes, we do. Are they unavoidable? Colleagues from the Commission will tell us they have the best overview with regards to the details, but we created a new instrument. We are demanding a lot also in terms of reforms from member states. So we see some delays, but at the end of the day, member states are asked and are tasked to do reforms, magnitude, at the speed at which they weren't really been doing them. Should we water down the rules that we have in the RRF? Obviously not. We don't want to. We cannot. We should respect them. We should make sure that countries fulfill all of the milestones and targets, implement the reforms. But what I want to say is the focus now, in spite of some delays which we have, which I believe were almost unavoidable, the focus should be on making sure that the milestones, targets are respected, reforms implemented, so that we can call the RRF a successful instrument by the end of 2026. Thank you very much. I believe also the role of the Parliament hasn't stopped in this process. We are in a permanent dialogue with the Commission, with the Directorate General, but also with the respective commissioners in making sure that we monitor this, that there is democratic legitimacy, accountability. I believe this is working. The dialogue between the institutions is good. We're thankful for the openness of the Commission, but for sure it is all still work in practice, and many conclusions which are worth today's debate, and some which should obviously also feed into the significant decisions that we're going to make with regards to the future budget of the European Union. Thank you for the debate. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Muroshan, and thank you to both of you for such detailed presentations. You really explained very clearly what are the challenges and milestones, but thank you also for bringing the political perspective in the discussion, because of course you are the best place to bring such perspective. We understand that you have other commitments in the House. It was great to have you with us today, but we understand also if you have to go that it has to happen. I would like now to turn to Alessandro D'Alfonso. Alessandro is the head of the Next Generation EU Monitoring Service in the EPRS. So he has done all this work that was presented before with his colleagues, and is going to moderate the panel now. Over to you, Alessandro.
Many thanks, Etienne, and again a warm thank you to Madame Laluc and Mr. Muroshan. Their insightful keynote speeches will be really instrumental in framing our debate. Is Next Generation EU delivering? The title of our event makes my role of moderator simpler, because we all have a clear question to answer. Is Next Generation EU, with its Recovery and Resilience Facility, delivering? I suggest dividing the question into three aspects. First, what have been the achievements so far? Second, we are in the final 2 years of implementations. Which are the challenges and risks that should be addressed? And third, what are the lessons that we can learn from these new instruments, also for the future design of EU finances? So, achievements, challenges, and future design. And we are very pleased to have a panel of distinguished speakers who are just the right person to help us explore these three aspects. Introducing them in order, starting from my left, Céline Gauer, Director General of the Recovery and Resilience Task Force at the European Commission. She's really at the very heart of RRF governance, I would say. Eulalia Rubio, Senior Research Fellow at the Jacques Delors Institute and at CEPS. She's a renowned expert on the EU budget and EU budgetary policies. Among many other publications, she has also contributed as an independent expert to the midterm review of the RRF. And Sander Tordoir, who is Chief Economist at the Center for European Reform. Sander has published widely on EU fiscal policy, economic governance, and he has also spoken in a European Parliament hearing on the reform of EU fiscal rules. Following the debate with our speakers, we will open the floor to questions. And online participants can ask questions through the chat at any time. So let's start. My first question is for you, Céline. We have heard also from Madame Laluc a reference to the midterm evaluation of the RRF. And last February, this midterm evaluation identified a number of positive findings, but also elements to improve. However, the conclusion was that it was still too early to assess fully the impacts of the RRF. So my question to you is, 8 months on, where do we stand?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone. And let me first thank you very much for organizing this debate. I think the Parliament is playing a critical role, not only in the design of the instrument, but also in its implementation. I think the very intensive scrutiny that the Commission has undergone under the working group on the RRF has been extremely helpful for the proper implementation. And I'm very pleased to see that the next session will be equally devoted to that. So has it delivered? Where do we stand a few months later? Yes, it has delivered, and I was very happy to hear Madame Laluc say that so clearly. It has delivered in a number of respects. The first one is on the recovery itself. So the facility was about recovery and resilience, and there is, I think, consensus today on the fact that the recovery part has worked. The fragmentation of the single market, which we all feared a lot during the pandemic, has not happened. Every member state could, irrespective of the fiscal space it was enjoying, could have a proper recovery plan, and we haven't seen a disconnection between the member states. So that was extremely positive. We also saw that the GDP level caught up very, very fast, and that the employment level also caught up very, very fast. So the recovery part, I think, has worked extremely well. What about the resilience? Still too early to say, but still not that early anymore, because we have less than two years to go. The reform part that Mr. Murzan was emphasizing so much is really working. I think it is the first time that the EU has at its disposal a tool that allows not only to foster investments, I think that we know with cohesion, we know with all the direct funding, but also to incentivize the critical reform that we have identified as, we, meaning the EU, has identified as critical for each and every member state. And we see that in all types of fields. So first, on the protection of EU financial interest. We see, for example, the Czech conflict of interest being finally solved. We see the fight against corruption being an absolute requirement for disbursing any fund to a country like Hungary. And I could go on with many other examples. So that works very, very well. The second thing that works very well are all the reforms that are needed for unlocking investments. There's no point in putting a lot of money on, for example, rolling out renewables in the EU budget funding this, if you have permitting rules that do not allow to connect them to the grid and to build them in a decent time. So all of this you also see working extremely well and very, very fast in the different plans. And finally, the infamous structural reforms. I think the one that we've been recommending for years without any success, to be honest, are being implemented. You see labor market reforms in Spain, very effective, labor marketplaces being created as we speak and already for quite some time. So extremely effective. Justice reform in Italy, pension reform in Romania, and I could make a very, very long list. And that, because they were front-loaded in the implementation of the plans, has already worked extremely well. Third thing that I think works well is the performance-based nature of the instrument. The instrument is not bring us your invoices a few years down the road and we'll pay back. No, it's about we make a contract, member state with the EU, to deliver a number of critical investments. And we heard about delays, but if you look at the reality on the ground, actually what we see is an unprecedented speed of rolling out investments. We see hospitals that have been put together. I think I was last week in Riga, brand new children's hospital emergency department, brand new, 2 years down the line, it's up and running, it's opening today actually. And we have this kind of examples for rails in Slovenia, for rails in Italy a lot as well. That is really, really happening. So this performance-based and this very, very focused timeline for implementing the investment is actually working well. So delays, do we really have delays? We are on track for more than 3/4 of the milestones that were due to date. So I think there are not many programs that can have the same results. We've already disbursed more than 40% of the overall envelope for loans and grants, nearly 50% for grants. So I think we're pretty well on track for the magnitude of the exercise. Thank you.
Many thanks. And we have heard that Next Generation EU and its centerpiece, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, are about recovery and resilience. So in a way, short and long-term objectives in the same instrument. And we know that short and long-term objectives may present trade-offs. Eulalia, a double question for you. How have these objectives been reconciled in Next Generation EU? And does result-based financing work well in both cases?
Thank you, Alessandro, and thank you very much for inviting me also to this conference. Yeah, that's a difficult question. Maybe let me start by saying that every time I'm invited to speak about RF, I get a bit nervous. And I get a bit nervous because at the beginning I didn't realize why I get so nervous to speak on RF. I have worked on RF. But in the end, I realized that I get nervous because it's a very strange animal, actually, the RF. And it's a very difficult animal to grasp. And it's the first of its kind also. So when someone asks me or asks someone else, is it delivering or not? It's very difficult to answer this question because it's delivering with respect to what? What is the benchmark? What should be the benchmark to judge whether or not it is a success or not, the RF? That's super difficult. We don't have anything similar to compare with. And on top of the fact that it's different from everything, it's very complex. I mean, if you look at the debates on EU cohesion policy, for instance, we have this endless debate on whether or not EU cohesion policy works or not. Why it is so difficult to answer this question? Because it's very complex. EU cohesion policy, it's country-specific. Every member state a bit uses the funds in a very different way. And on top of that, the overarching objective, which is, to support development of regions, it's influenced by many factors. So there is always this endless question whether or not it has been additional. What is, the impact, the role of cohesion policy with respect to integration in the market or wherever else, or, macroeconomic stability of the country. In DRF, we have the same problem, but even more pronounced. First, because the overarching objective, it's even more complex than the cohesion policy. In the cohesion policy, at least we know that it's a long-term investment policy. So we can pose the question whether or not these funds have served to transform or develop the region's economy. In the case of the DRF, we combine, as you said, the two type of objectives. It was if you look at the DRF regulation, it was supposed to mitigate the short-term impact of the crisis and at the same time help to the resilience in the long term, and at the same time transform the economies through support the green and digital transition. And then on top of that, with Repower EU, we have add other objectives more specific, like, helping with the resilience and the sustainability of the energy system. So, I mean, in cohesion policy, circles, we talk about goal congestion and the difficulties to evaluate. In the case of RRF, goal congestion is even more accentuated. So that's the first question. The second question is in terms of delivery. In the case of cohesion policy, we just give money for investments. In the case of the RRF, we do two different things that are different in terms of delivery model. One is reform conditionality, and we have a huge literature for IMF from the people that normally gives the loans condition to reforms, that whether or not it works, how to define, how to use this reform conditionality, how to define the reform steps or the conditions to release the money. And then on the other hand, you have the investment part. And sometimes people put the accent on the reform part, sometimes people put the accent on the investment part, but each of these two things create different and very important challenges for itself. And on top of that, we have innovated in the way of releasing the funds, as Celine was saying, with this performance-based budgeting, which in itself also it's the first of its kind, so it's very difficult to know. So altogether makes very difficult to know whether or not it works or not. And if you look at the national level, I mean, one way of doing it would be it's the way we do it, have these milestones and targets been achieved, or they are being achieved according to the initial plans, but then you have to look at the national level. If you look at the national level, you see very different ways in which member states have decided to use this money. Take the case, for instance, I take the case of France. What France did basically was to finance each, France Relance plan, which was basically a short-term plan to get out of the crisis. I mean, the main objective of the France Relance plans, which was partly financed by the RRF, was to get to achieve the growth levels of pre-COVID in 2022. So it was not really a transformational plan. They did another investment plan, that is France 2030, which is more transformational. But the main objective of the France Relance plan was to finance, getting out of the crisis. And if you look in terms of milestones and targets and disbursement, France is the one that is much more advanced. Why? Because they front-load a lot of RRF payments to finance things that were already put into place. That's totally different from the choice made by Italy, for instance, that they tried really to transform the economy. So even if you go and you look at the milestones and targets, it's very difficult to draw lessons comparing plans because they are totally different things, financed by the same EU-level instrument. So altogether is to say the difficulty to get an assessment of whether or not it works. And this puts even more pressure to us and to the Commission, because now we are saying we will take this as a template to use it for other things. So we really need to understand how it works and what has it worked or not. And I must say the Commission has done a very good job in helping member states to disburse the money on time. But there is always this, ultimate questions. How do we answer this question, whether or not it is a success, when it is a kind of, common pot of fund that has served to finance very different things at the national level?
Thank you, Eulalia. Indeed, I take your expression. It's a complex animal to investigate, but an interesting one, I would say. And we have heard also during the keynote speeches references to the recovery part of the instrument. So among the many innovations that Next Generation EU and the Recovery and Resilience Facility have brought about, we have also the fact that it has allowed the EU budget for the first time to take on a fiscal stabilization function. Sander, what is your assessment in that respect?
Thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me. So I thought I would go back a little bit longer and go back to 2012, 2013, which was a very dark period for the Eurozone, for the EU. We were the only major advanced economy in the world to have a double-dip recession. And why was that? Well, we had blown out spreads. We had a number of countries that were under severe bond market pressure. And partly as a result of that, and partly as a result of misguided austerity, we essentially pushed ourselves into a second recession. So if you look at the cyclically adjusted primary surplus we ran in the midst of a crisis, it was 2% of Eurozone GDP. So that's, it's a massive tightening in the middle of a crisis. And it's also interesting that in some sense, the intellectual seed for the RRF was placed in the year 2013, because Angela Merkel floated the idea of reform contracts, which was essentially public investments from Europe in exchange for structural reforms at the national level. That never really went anywhere. But I think, I just want to point out that I think this is one important benchmark against which we can measure the recovery fund, because the response was so different in 2020, right? So instead of, letting spreads blow out, instead of running very tight fiscal policy, there was this decision in May 2020 by Merkel and Macron to say we're going for a large joint fiscal operation. But it's actually very poorly designed as a stabilization fund. That is the interesting thing about it, because it is a public investment fund, and a public investment fund takes a long time to roll out. If you want to do stabilization, the classic thing you do, the Americans are very good at this, you send literally checks to households, right? Or you cut taxes, neither of which is feasible for the EU. Now, why do I think this recovery fund still helped stabilize the Eurozone economy? Is because it empowered member states to run much more loose fiscal policy, right? So if you look at bond yields in 2020, the spread explodes. The first time it really goes down is when the ECB announces PEP, and the second time it really goes down is when there's the decision to go for the recovery fund. So basically, you're empowering national fiscal policy to do that. But for the future, that means that if we want to think of a stabilization function for Europe, then I think the RRF design is not necessarily the best blueprint for the future, because then you have to think about the consumption dimension. And in fact, this is something where things are not actually going that well in the recovery, right? So if you look at GDP growth since 2019, the median for Eurozone countries outside our stagnating giant Germany is 6%, pretty good. Some grew at 15%. But France, Germany, and Italy are on the lower end of that growth spectrum. And in fact, consumers are not spending that much in Europe. We haven't spent our excess savings, and the savings rate is going up again right now. So I think you see that weakness in the sort of stabilization dynamic play out. That's my first message. The second question is more on the allocation side, so this public investment question. That was the other legacy of the Euro crisis, is that as a percentage of the Eurozone GDP, public investment declined from 4 to around 3% for the whole decade. Now it's back up to almost 4. Maybe Celine can correct me where it is, but it's really gone up significantly, particularly in Southern Europe. Some of that's distorted by the controversial super bonus scheme in Italy, but it is still unequivocally clear that public investment has gone up. So that's the sort of second good news, more on the allocation side. We do have this issue that, and it comes back to the tension between those two objectives, that the money is going out rather slowly, right? So we heard some data here. I think only 5 member states are above 50% in terms of fulfilling their programs. We were expecting to be at 60% for all. My native country, the Netherlands, I think hasn't really done anything. So some countries are not doing very much. Is that a problem? Well, again, if you want to have a strong recovery, maybe in the future, yes, that's too slow, right? We're 4 years after when the first shock hit. At the same time, it's also an opportunity from the public investment side, because it means that we still have quite a lot of money to smoothen out public investment over a long time. And on top of that, we have this mountain of cohesion money, of which we've only decided to spend 20. This is often perceived as criticism. I think it's an opportunity, because it means that we have the N+3 rule, so we can keep spending that beyond 2027. That means you can have a very nice, next 4 or 5 years where we have a lot of European money actually to keep public investment high. But then comes the political elephant, which is then you actually have to extend the RRF deadline, right? And that's what some of the frugal countries then want. So then German politicians will say, oh, you should make sure that you spend it all by 2026. And at the same time, they say, we don't want it to be spent on bad projects. And then the European Court of Auditors rightly says those two things cannot be true at the same time. If you put an arbitrary pressure on member states to spend, they will spend, but they will not spend it on the right project. So I think it's very important to actually move the deadline out. The second thing that I would do is to, in the future, again, the tension between stabilization and allocation. Stop me if I'm too long. Is that I think we should learn more from the American model of federalism. So the Americans basically have two types of grants that they give to states. One are block grants that states get no matter what. So, are related to unemployment, related to emergency health spending, etc. There's no conditionality, so it's quick. Celine and her team do not have to be looking at everything, all the reforms they can disperse. You still want to keep the receipts, but you can disperse. And then they have categorical grants where they basically look at what's happening with the spending, and actually American states then have to do what we might call structural reforms to get federal money. So I think that logic of separating European spending into what we want to go fast and where we want to say has a long-term growth objective would be helpful to put in future programs. And I wanted to say a few things on the bonds and how the bonds are doing, but maybe for really
the vocations. Many thanks. Indeed, I think you have touched on many points. My next question is the same for all of you, and is what are the key challenges to be addressed in the next 2 years? We've heard also the deadline 2026, should it be postponed, or other elements have been raised during the conversation. So possibly we can reverse the order, and would you like to start with this one? And you can also use this question as an occasion possibly to react to what has been said by the other speakers. So Sander, would you like to start on this one?
Yeah, I can be quite brief. So I think the main challenge is to extend the deadline. So for example, on reform implementation success, and it's in your new paper, which gives a great overview. I think the milestones reached are now 23%. And Celine was just saying a lot is on track. That is actually very successful for a European reform program. Because if you look at the country-specific recommendations of the European semester, between 2010 and 2018, only 9% was implemented. So in a world where you don't have European money to put a little bit of pressure on member states to also help parts of the government that want to do reforms, you don't get many reforms. With the RRF, we're already at 23% after we still have 2 years to go. So I think doing that extension and making sure that we finish a lot of these difficult projects is essential. The other challenge is, of course, on repayment, which is also looming quite large. And we know that the repayment burden will be somewhere between 0.10 and 0.16% of EU GNI. So we have to figure out how to find space in the budget for that and do all the other things that people talk about, like defense or having a green industrial policy. My sense is we don't really need new own resources for that. So I think the GNI-based contribution system that then provides the credit guarantee for the EU bonds is working well enough. I don't think that bond investors would particularly care if we link repayment of EU bonds to a tax on plastic or a wealth tax. Or I think that they just want to be repaid, and they see the member states as underwriting the debt. What is a concern is that EU bonds are trading not particularly well, right? They're doing fairly well, but it would be great if the yield was a little lower. And it may help if they're just longer on the market. So the EIB's yield, which is the longest issuing sort of supranational borrower, is the lowest if you look at ESM, EU, and EIB. So there's some hope, I think, for the future.
Thank you. Eulalia?
Yeah, thank you. Well, what shall be done until 2026? I mean, on extension, I totally agree. I think that would be great. We know that it's a political question, and it's very, very difficult. We know what is the position of member states on that, and that we need an agreement plus ratification have this extension. So we know what are the obstacles, but in an ideal situation, I think it would be good to have an extension of the deadline. Other things that need to be done, in my opinion, to deliver on time and in good terms. Well, there is the question of administrative capacity, which does not affect the delivery of all plans. I do not think that the Dutch plan has a problem of administrative capacity, taking place the amounts of money they have to deliver, but it affects the greatest ones. And when we look at how these plans were designed, we see that in some cases there were some measures to improve the administrative capacity, to reinforce the capacity of the administrations, but very much focused on the national level, actually. And many of these things are delivered at the local level or the regional level. So maybe we need to take into account this and to pay attention of whether these authorities at the subnational level have the capacity to deliver. Third point, maybe, that is not so much taken into account, but I think it's important, is to think right now on how to render, the legacy of these investments and reforms, how to render them permanent when RF ends. In many cases, there are temporary investments that have been done for which, if we don't have a replacement at the national level, either through cohesion funds or through national funding, that will be an one-off investment, one-off spending that will not last forever. And I'm thinking, for instance, the case of Italy with the strengthening of the judiciary councils, that it's something, it has been used to staff these judiciary offices with RF funds, but then once the RF will end, what will happen with this staff? We will just deplete again the offices, or that will be, replaced by national funding. That's very important, otherwise there is no lasting effect on that. And then 4th point, maybe to be more open, but I think the Commission already is, maybe Celine will tell us, but more open to the possibility of changing or modifying some milestones and targets. Knowing that the regulation is quite strict on the procedure to modify these things, it's not easy, but because it has to be justified that there's an external, I don't remember the formulation, but something exceptional that is happening. But we know that in 6 years, there are plenty of justifications to review some of the milestones and targets, especially because they were formulated in a speed of time, very short time. So sometimes, even it was, sometimes was mistakes in the way of formulating the milestones or the validation mechanism or to achieve this, to validate the achievement of these milestones and targets.
Thank you. Well, the good thing in speaking last is that I agree with most of what was said. For the 4 points. The first one, I agree, repayment is a challenge. I'm sure there will be an agreement and we will find a good solution for it, but it is, as long as we haven't, clearly a challenge. The second, I would put ownership, because these plans are very ambitious. They do include investments, fine, but they also do include difficult reforms. As rightly pointed out in your paper, the reforms were often front-loaded because it made sense to solve the problems early in the day. But still, for many, we have, for tax reforms, for pension reforms, for long-term care reforms, we have the final milestones towards the end of the plan. And of course, those who negotiated the plan on the member states level very often are no longer there. Parliaments have changed, and to keep the ownership and to keep the commitment to deliver on the reform agenda, even though it is a pretty obvious reform agenda because it comes from the country-specific recommendations that we've had for years, is not easy. And the longer, as the more time passes between the moment where you negotiate and the moment where you implement, the bigger the challenge for delivering. The third thing is administrative capacity. And I look at local level and at national level, we have in a number of plans, including the Italian plan, quite a number of measures to strengthen also the organization at local level and to support or create structure for supporting the local level, for example, in Italy on procurement, because we're completely aware that this is also where it's being played, but that stays and that will remain a challenge going forward. My hope is that because in those countries that have the biggest challenge, we have we have also public administration reforms and training of the public administration, then we may over time also improve the situation structurally. And of course, the biggest challenge that you have both also referred to is time. But where I'm not sure I agree is whether the challenge, as you said, is to extend the deadline. I don't think so. I don't think we should try to extend, because actually the money has flowed really, really well. You said it's flowing slowly. No, it's not flowing slowly. Sometimes I'm scared to see how fast it is flowing. So it is flowing well. We don't have what cohesion colleagues talk as an absorption problem. We don't really have an absorption problem in DRF at all. And because of the ownership constraint I was mentioning before, if we drag on too much, this is simply time to rethink and maybe, well, the hospital here, do we really want to do it here? Or wouldn't it be better to do it somewhere else? End result, you don't do it anywhere. Or this reform, actually, shouldn't we do another reform or think it completely different? And then you risk undermining quite dramatically the result if you drag on. The benefit of this 2026, which we clearly hadn't chosen, but the benefit of the 2026 deadline is that it has accelerated, and those investments are needed. You said that the French plan was only about quick fixes for the recovery. Actually, not only. You had a lot of energy efficiency that you find in all the member states and where you have a need to move fast. You also have a lot of research and development and decarbonization of industry. Which again is a really strict commitment we have to take very, very fast. So I don't think we should slow down. I think we should really do everything we can together with the member states to deliver by the deadline. Then that begs your last question, which is what about flexibility? Will the Commission finally be flexible? Yes, we are very flexible. Look at we published last, when was it, February or so, a communication on flexibilization and acceleration. And the tool we are using is essentially revision of the plans. And we are doing that in a targeted manner when we see for payment requests that we have issues, or more generally when we see that some investments run into trouble. And it's also completely okay, as you said, that some investments run into trouble. Sometimes the member states, when they propose their plans, simply misassessed the needs. So the demand, they make calls for proposals, and the uptake of those calls is completely varied, very successful in one, not so successful on the other. So it makes absolute sense if you, for example, have support to companies to decarbonize or move to more renewables-based electricity generation. If one is more successful than the other, it makes all sense of the world to redirect the allocation and then allow them to make more of what works very well. And that we are really doing on a daily basis. You will see more and more that the plans are modified for each payment request. And I think that's fine. And I think that the process that the Council has imposed on us of having to go back there is actually helpful. Because then everyone is taking, it's not the Commission doing something alone that could be criticized easily by the Court of Auditor or by the Council. It is actually very transparent. Everyone is aware, everyone agrees that this is the right thing to do, and then we move forward. And I think with that tool of flexibilization and efficiency, we'll be there. We'll be there and we'll manage. Maybe we'll decommit a few loans towards the very end. That may happen if, for example, these huge financial instruments that we have are not taken up the way they were conceived. But overall, I think we are doing pretty okay. And also because of what you said on cohesion funding, which is only at 5% payment at the moment. So we're here more than 50 or 5% for cohesion. We need also to make space for those local investments which are not exactly the same. They're complementary. So we need to make space for them. So let's not push for extension. Let's push for focus, ownership, and delivery.
Thank you, Céline. Eulalia, back to you. A criticism that we have heard about the RRF also today is that it has to some extent renationalized EU spending. On the one hand, regional and local authorities have complained that their views have not been taken sufficiently into account. On the other, there are fewer cross-border projects in the national plans that we might have hoped for. And how can future instruments ensure better coordination of the EU, regional and national levels when it comes to investment?
Well, these are two different questions, actually. One thing is about involvement of subnational authorities, or let's say take into account the territorial cohesion within the country. And another thing is about the capacity to finance cross-border or multi-country projects. On the regional aspect, I think it's quite consensual now that it should be done differently in the future. It was. We have said already it was a crisis mechanism put into place in a short time, and it was not sufficiently stressed the need to involve subnational authorities. I think everybody agrees on that this was a failure, not only because supranational authorities are not happy, but because it is much better and is much more effective a plan that is designed and implemented in conjunction with subnational authorities, and also because this is an instrument that is based on the article, on the treaty legal basis for cohesion. So it should be, and something that when you look at the national level, national plans, not all plans have this in mind, actually, the intra-territorial, distribution, let's say. No, so I think in the future it should not be done the same way. That's for sure. On multi-country projects, that's a bit more difficult. I think, per definition, one type of fund like this, like cohesion policy, is not well designed to support multi-country projects. I mean, maybe you have to distinguish between two types of multi-country projects. One is the typical, the classic cross-border infrastructures. And for this, I mean, let's take the idea of Marco Wood, of EU public goods provided at the EU level. These are typically public goods that have to be provided at the EU level. You can place a bit of EU funding, manage at the national level to support this type of public goods, but the logic thing is to have, an overview at the EU level of which are the missing links and where you have to put the money, and to provide it and implement at the EU level so that you also address all the problems of interoperability and, differences in regulatory differences. And this is the logic of the Connecting Europe facility. So if we have to finance this type of things, better doing at the EU level. Then, of course, I mean, if you want to use a bit of this type of funds to finance this, then you have to reserve a part of this, like it is done for cohesion policy. You have Interreg, and you have a reserve of money that is only used for this. Because otherwise, naturally, I mean, it's normal, national level authorities will not put money on this because it's very difficult, very complex. Then there are the other types of multi-country projects, which are these IPCEIs, for instance, the type of national projects that have an identity in their own. I mean, they can provide benefits on their own, but that provide much more benefit if coordinated at the EU level, because, for instance, part of an overall EU initiative to promote the emergence of a value change at the EU level that is of key importance. For this type of projects, I think it makes more sense to use this type of shared management funds to provide these projects. Also because you can address the problem of concentration. If you only use state aid flexibilities, we know that there is a tendency for certain countries to have more capacity to fund this kind of projects. So. But what is the problem, or what has been the problem of the RF to finance this type of projects? I think one of the problems is that these type of projects are also very innovative by nature. And RF is not very well designed to promote, to finance highly risky projects also. You need to put, objectives, you need to, I mean, I think Mr. Murshant said, it's much more, prone to finance mature projects, that you can easily finance, define the objective, and then you will receive the money. So it's more the delivery logic than the fact of being at the national level for this type of projects, I would say.
Meet the 2026 deadline, which is there for everybody. And actually, you have also mentioned energy, the green transition, and actually the RRF is a temporary top-up to the EU budget until 2026. We will not forget this year, I think. However, the RRF currently accounts for 35% of EU investment in climate action, and 70% of EU spending in digital objectives. And also the Draghi report has highlighted the need to invest much more in energy infrastructure, so cross-border projects. So with these huge investment needs in both areas, can we afford to go back to business as usual once the RRF is over? Céline, I think this is for you.
Thanks a lot. And if I may, I would like to pick up on the cross-border just for a second before.
Absolutely.
I fully agree with what Aurelia says, and I think that's a really, really important point to make. This RRF was not designed for cross-border. The reason why, in particular, the Parliament pushed a lot for cross-border and also in Repower EU, we even have this target of 30% of cross-border projects in Repower EU, was because there's this huge pot of money that came on top of the EU budget, and there was a feeling that we should make sure that it contributes to EU, to EU values or EU objectives. Actually, I think it does very much, both Repower and RRF proper, does contribute, but does contribute into the implementation at national level of EU policies. Take energy efficiencies, I mentioned already, I think energy efficiency is an EU policy that was really struggling to be implemented properly years after years. The RRF is delivering on that, but it is not well suited for a cross-border energy interconnector or for a cross-border rail line, not so much because it's complex or innovative, because there are a lot of innovative and complex project finance, because you can find milestones and targets that do capture this type of investment. So the innovativity for me is not a problem at all. We do have that in the thing. The problem is that it comes from the alignment in time and delivery of different member states. And that it may not be priority. We've seen that at the beginning, that some say you had Austria, Germany, and one said, yeah, we absolutely want to finance that by the RRF. The other one was said, no way. And then, okay, but then what do? It will be financed at the end of the day by other tools, but not as a common one. And you would also need to both take the risk and put the risk of your delivery in the hands of your neighbor, because if he fails to deliver, then you will not get the money. So cross-border projects, it is just the wrong tool, which shows that we have to push together for a significant budget that is directly managed at EU level for the proper cross-border. And on Interreg, of course, but we are talking hiking trails and we're talking very, very small things. So a top-up of national envelopes is probably not what can deliver on very significant cross-border. But still, I really think that the added value is coming from the implementation at national level of the EU policies. So can we go back to business as usual? There are two questions there. One question is about the size of the budget, and the second question is about how we spend it. On the size of the budget, I think that's going to be debated a lot, and I agree with what was said before. It doesn't really matter whether it's borrowed or simply financed by the increase in contribution. I think that's a choice that the member states will make together. What matters at the end of the day is the firepower that we do have at EU level to support integration. On the way to deliver and the way to spend, I really think also that we shouldn't go back to where we were before, because there are three things that I would really like to see from the RRF in the next instrument, whatever. I think it's going to be a cohesion instrument most likely, and it's good so, but whatever the name it has. The first one is reforms. That was emphasized by many of the speakers, and I think the inclusion of reform has finally allowed us to deliver on these country-specific recommendations that were always, we all agree and nobody does anything, or 9% implementation after several years. And this makes a difference, and this is fundamental, and the RF showed that it can work. So that I would really want to see in whatever next instrument we have. The second element is a performance-based. Performance-based has worked. It doesn't only work because it's more effective and allows a quicker also uptake of the projects, but it also works because it allows to channel the investments to what really matters. If you have a problem of waste or water treatment, this is where you go, this is what you do, and you commit to a certain solution. You don't say, well, I'll do something green. No, you want to know exactly what you do, and this is what the RF allows to do. And the third element that I think is really worth preserving is the fact that you have one single envelope, which is very large, with one single set of rules for everything. Because when we had the war in Ukraine, which we don't forget that we are doing quite well in absorption, but we had a war in between the conception of the plans and their delivery, we could redirect very quickly, we could do Repower EU within the same envelope because it was one set of rules and because you didn't have to shop whatever projects or investment into small bits and pieces that would fit into the different funds that we would have had to manage. One set of rules, much simpler, and the flexibility to adjust when you have to adjust. So these are really, for me, the three things that mean that we shouldn't go back to where we were before. I'm not saying it's perfect. I agree with everything that Eulalia said on the involvement of the local and regional stakeholders. Parliament pushed for that last time, not sufficiently, not successfully because it was not a legal requirement. I think for next time we have to do better. And on transparency, again, the member states have all the data, they have all the final beneficiaries, they are under an obligation to have that. So there's no obligation to publish them. And maybe for the next instrument, that's something we want to look at.
Thank you. A final question for Sander before we open the floor for the questions. As of 2028, the EU will have to start repaying NGO borrowing. And also in light of the competitiveness report by Mr. Draghi, how can we ensure that these repayments do not translate into reduced capacity for the EU investor to invest in the future? There is an idea also about rolling over at least part of NGO. I would like to recall as well that the European Parliament has called very strongly for the introduction of new own resources. Also because in a way the GNI resource is sometimes perceived as a resource that triggers net contributors, net beneficiaries debates rather than a focus on EU added value when discussing the EU budget. So, Sander.
Is this one working? Yeah. So just on the deadline question, I think we may end up in this in an area where Europe is going to be great because we're always so last minute on cutting political deals. So we will go all the way to 2026. There will be a lot of pressure for ownership, which is good, I agree. And then if we're not quite there yet, then we do a small delay or an extension, which is good, right? So I think maybe we end up in the best of both worlds that we were arguing for. Then on your question on the bonds and if we should roll them over, I would say from a capital market standpoint, unequivocally yes, because it means that the Commission will be a much more stable, perpetual sort of issuer in the market, and that bondholders see, okay, this is not just a 30-year window, which then quickly goes down after 2028, but there's this universe of EU bonds that's out there and that gets rolled over, at least in part, right? So I think there are reasons to believe that that would be attractive, and it may even bring down the cost of borrowing for the EU and bring it a bit closer to, let's say, the EIB, right, which is de facto a perpetual sort of actor in the market. There are also political reasons to do it, as you were alluding to, Alessandro, because it means that you have to repay. You can smear out repayment over a longer period, but of course there's a trade-off because it does mean once you roll over the full life cycle of the program, your interest burden is going to be higher, right? So this will be the decision: do you kick the can down the road, capture some of the capital market upside, but ultimately the taxpayer bill is a little bit higher. So I think this is the conundrum. I understood the Draghi report as saying some rollover is beneficial for all these reasons, and then the big European safe asset debate, which I think we should avoid today. So I'll leave it there.
Many thanks to all of you. It is now time to open the floor to the audience, both in the room and online. Please introduce yourself and ask your question briefly so that we can take as many as possible.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. My name is Stella Veliki. I have studied physics and informatics, and I am a member of the European Physical Society. And I have a very short question. How do you control if the EU funding for the non-EU country is correctly used? I think that in your tools and what you have for the EU financing, you don't give more attention to the control. If EU give a lot of money, that's a good thing. You have no control how the money is used, not for EU state and not for non-EU state.
I see a question here in the first row.
Hello, my name is Tim Peters. I work for the European Parliament. I wanted to follow up on the question on the renationalization of the EU budget that Alessandro already asked, but then it was only more like how are regions involved and member states and so on. I mean, isn't it a central design flaw that the EU in now NGU was making the debts or paying, and the member states spend it, but the European Parliament was not fully involved, so it was not part of the budget. It's an off-budget instrument, and so a very limited control and limited influence of the European political level. I mean, the Commission can check the plan, but I mean, paper is patient, so member states can write, but in the end they spend the money in their national rules, and so the EU only has a limited influence. And shouldn't it be that we increase rather the EU budget and then spend more through the EU budget? Should that not be more the future?
And I see a question here.
Yeah. Hello, hi. Vasilis Margaras from EPRS, the usual cohesion policy suspect here. So you have all mentioned, and the politicians also mentioned, the issue of cannibalizing, policies and all that. And there is a big question on the table on cohesion policy and how you can make cohesion policy and next generation EU more, more going together. So there have been contradictions, there have been fears, and I would like to ask Celine, but all the panel as well, because you mentioned cohesion policy. What can cohesion policy learn from next generation EU? What next generation EU learn from cohesion policy? And overall, how we can make the two more compatible with each other? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And possibly, I see there is a question from the online audience here.
Are we on? Yeah. Okay. So we have a question from Alison Hunter, and she has one directed at Ms. Gower. She says that the RRF has unlocked the path towards reforms in the member states, but she wonders whether this has set a risky precedent for the EU to finance domestic reforms in the future, and are all domestic reforms delivering EU added value to begin with? And then Alison has another question to all panelists, and she basically wants to know if the RRF will be successful in the developed countries instead of in the EU as a whole, and will this further the divide between the less developed and more developed countries in the EU?
Many thanks. And I see a lady.
Thank you very much. I'm Megan Richards. I wanted to ask a question relating to the Draghi report and the importance of increasing competitiveness, the important reforms that need to be taken. Can't the RFF be a very useful example of driving forward in the future financing that's going to be required to get the EU to make these reforms? You've said it's been very successful in driving forward reforms and bringing in private sector money as well to encourage those reforms to go forward. And just a small point on energy efficiency. I'm not sure it was the RFF that was such an incentive on energy efficiency. There was money floating around for many years. I think it was really energy prices that helped drive that push to get
more funding for energy efficiency.
Thank you. We have already quite a few questions. I would ask each of you to choose one to reply to.
Is this working? Yeah. Great questions. Sorry, I just had to whip out my phone because there were so many. So I think there was a question about how you check on outside EU countries and how you check on their budgeting. I mean, this is sort of its own universe because we have long experience in development aid. We have the World Bank and the IMF checking also in some of these countries together with EU partners. So I think I'm not sure that the RF model is easily replicable there because we have this, inside the EU, we have this whole coordination system that you just cannot really have with outside countries unless, you know, there are EU accession countries. So I think that's maybe where that logic could come in a little bit more. There was a question on the European level versus the member state level on the spending. My sense is there's also a trade-off there. So I take your point that, you know, this Hamiltonian moment of the RF was not really a moment where we did proper federal spending at the European level, because essentially we're issuing bonds and then redistributing the money directly back to the member states. But the trade-off is always that does get the money on the ground maybe more quickly than trying to set up this whole new governance at the European level. I think you can do that in certain areas. I think that picks up on the Draghi report question, because we have now this big debate around European industrial policy. Do we need European money? There was von der Leyen's push to have a sovereignty fund that would invest in common European green industrial projects. That didn't really go anywhere. We got a step proposal that is, I think, a shadow of what she had envisioned, but it comes back. So I think in those areas, you can think of specific funds with specific European governance. I think that's probably more useful than the kind of large program that the RF is, which will always happen more in a crisis, I think. So that would be a bit my intuition. And I forgot your point on resource, Sandro, and I have this interesting observation that I think we haven't really thought much about, which is that we're going to impose a lot of tariffs on China soon, which means that there will be quite a lot of tariff income coming in soon, which in principle gets subtracted from member states' contributions. But why not put all that money into a European industrial fund, right? Why not? It could be 5 years down the line, 5 billion a year, 10 billion a year, depending on the policy choices we make. So just an idea.
Thank you, Sander. Eulalia?
Well, I will link a bit the questions on the Draghi report, the new joint debt, and also this question of whether or not increasing the EU budget rather than creating off-budget instruments. I think that, well, knowing how difficult it is to increase the EU budget, one of the advantages of these off-budget instruments is a little more easier to do it, actually. And that's not a negligible advantage, even if it's, you know, it's a matter of political economy. I mean, we would like to have a bigger budget, but we know that it's very difficult. But there is this challenge of how to control and how to get these off-budget instruments accountable, particularly to the European Parliament. This has been done as an ad hoc arrangements for NGU, and I think in the future, if we see that there's going to be, you know, this modus operandi of using off-budget instruments, it's going to become permanent. We need a serious reflection how to get these instruments accountable, how to improve, for instance, the reporting of risks related with the use of these guarantees. I mean, all these things merits a bit an in-depth reflection, more beyond, you know, what we have done just for NGU. Then on the Draghi, more on the purpose of joint debt, I think I agree with the point of Céline that it's important to have common rules, to be flexible, to use from one policy to the other. On the other hand, if we raise new debt, I think it's important to be very targeted and to put very concrete objectives. Also because it will be much more easier to convince member states to raise debt if it's for a very specific purpose than if it's for a multi-purpose fund as we have done today. I mean, when you ask NGO has delivered, I was thinking, the first time I saw this question, I was thinking, imagine asking this to a government, actually. It has delivered the latest 5-year bond you have raised. I mean, we have used NGO to finance very different things. So it's much easier to track and to control the use of new debt if we put a very specific purpose to this debt. And then on control for non-EU countries, I mean, RRF is not for non-EU countries, but of course this template we are going to use, and we are already using it for Ukraine, for Western Balkans, so I think it's a very relevant question. Is it well designed? It is the good template to use for non-EU countries. It is, but maybe we have also to adjust it a bit when we talk about, because for the control part, when we use performance-based delivery more, we really have to trust a lot the national control systems. And the argument or the response from the Commission when someone put a question mark on that is saying, well, we put some super milestones at the beginning so that we make sure that they put into place the reforms so that then we can we'll be sure that the national control systems work. Yes, but let's do this for the candidate countries. It's a bit more difficult, actually. We are talking about countries that have very important, weak control systems. So I think it is important that if you apply this model to certain countries in which there are serious and systemic weaknesses, then maybe you have to put a bit more control at the EU level. But that's my opinion on that.
Thanks a lot, and I'll try to cover some of the rest. But I'll pick up immediately on the controls. I think it's not that we check the systems of the member states and then we let go. I think the RF is probably the most audited animal that we have at EU level. First, because the Court of Auditor has developed a very keen interest in auditing it. I think we are today at 11 performance and review audits. I don't think that is any ever, even across several programming period, that has triggered so many audits and reviews by the court, in addition to auditing each and every single payment we are making. So it is a massive scrutiny from the auditors. And as a consequence, a massive scrutiny from all sides, because we're not only auditing the systems of the member states, but also the way that they apply it. So if anything to be reviewed is whether we haven't gone a bit too far in claiming that actually we check the system of the member states, it's fine, but we're checking and rechecking sometimes 3 times between the member states audits and the Court of Auditors audits the milestones. So if anything, maybe a lot. On the renationalization and on the role of the parliament, I think what is really interesting here is the difference between what's on paper and the reality. Again, the involvement of the parliament on the implementation of the RF, and I'm not only talking about the discharge, where we are going as we are actually for the rest of the EU budget, but also on the very concrete implementation, on the negotiation of the plans, on the reporting, on the progress made by the member states, has been huge. Much more than for any other EU spending. Since this working group that has more than 30 sessions in a matter of a few years, the political level appearing there every second month, I think it's been a huge level of scrutiny. So indeed, it's off budget. So we may think that it's less than when it is in the budget, but the reality of the implementation is different. So I'm not saying that we should do off budget, but I'm saying that in reality, the parliamentary control has been extremely strong. So the debate for me is not so much it's renationalized, we have nothing at EU level, then it's more between the national level and the local level, where we should have the discussion to see how in the design and in the implementation we can do better at local level. I think it was quite beneficial to also look across regions and not only to have the micro view, because for some structural investments and reform you have a need even in the federal countries for a national take. So there was also a benefit for having this national interlocutor for the Commission, but we need to get the balance much better than it was. Then there was a question on the reforms. Isn't it risky to finance EU reforms and domestic reforms, and are all reforms eligible? So first, a clarification on how we cost the plans. Basically, on all the plans, we cost the investments. And then the reforms come in addition. So we're not paying directly. You do a labor market reform, I give you X or Y euro. This is not the way it works. If you take, for example, the Spanish plan, it's costed fully on the investment. And then, because you have the country-specific recommendation, there is an obligation for the member state to add, as deliverables, a number of critical reforms. All reforms? Not at all. I think you will find a lot, because some member states were very keen on adding. But what we really cared about were the critical answers to the country-specific recommendation. And the consequence of not meeting a reform is to have subtraction of payment. But it's not because you put a reform that you get more money. No, the money you get it for the investment. I think that's quite a bit complicated, a bit technical, but quite important to understand. Can the RF be an example for private financing? You have actually a lot within the RF of leveraging of private financing, in particular through the financial instruments. Almost, with the exception of Italy and Romania and a little bit Portugal, but all the rest of the loan compartment is being used to finance financial instruments, namely to give guarantees or loans to private companies to implement investments that are fulfilling a number of requirements. So it's been actually the first time that we were so successful next to InvestEU to roll out guarantees and loans, and not only grants as we have done for many years in cohesion. And finally, on cohesion, what can cohesion learn from the RF, and what can the RF learn from cohesion? I think I'll come back to my 3 and 3. So what can the cohesion learn from the RF? The reforms, because enabling conditions are not as effective as a reform that triggers a lack of payment as you go along with a very strict reversal rule. So reform, yes. Performance, yes, because we have some timid attempts and pilots in cohesion, but here this is a completely different dimension. And the one fund and one fund only. We had the CPR, which is already a very good start, but which is not covering the entire budget clearly. So the fact that you have one single set of rules. So these are the 3 things that I would think can be taken over by cohesion. What would the RF had merited to learn from cohesion? Ownership of the local level and involvement of stakeholders. Some member states, I think that's the case of Poland, for example, are using a very similar structure for the implementation. They're using the kind of monitoring committee that we know for cohesion for the RF. And I think that's a good thing, because it's much more inclusive than the normal way of implementing. So that is certainly a thing to learn, at least from cohesion.
Many thanks. We have certainly covered a lot of ground, and the creation and launch of Next Generation EU were among the main achievements of the last political cycle. From what we have heard today, we can conclude that the work is not over, I would say. The effective completion of Next Generation EU and the impact of its legacy will be among the key elements in the spotlight during the coming term. I invite you to join me in a warm round of applause for our excellent speakers. You have really skillfully steered us through these crucial topics for our common future. If you are interested in more information, have a look at the EPRS briefings on the individual national plans, their sectoral and governance aspects, as well as our weekly updated interactive infographic. Last but not least, the next EPRS event will take place in the same reading room this Thursday at 1:30 in the afternoon. And it will be a fascinating book talk on how speeches can bring trust in democracy. Do not miss it. So thanks again, and not least to all the colleagues who have made this roundtable possible. I wish everyone a nice afternoon.